It's Kansas, 1888. The fields stretch endlessly under a blazing sun, but in the white-owned stores and farmhouses, the air is thick with rage. Former Confederate sympathizers and local clansmen gather around saloons, their faces twisted in anger. They spit and curse the day they ever heard his name. A black man, a former slave, a man who started with 90 cents and now made more than every white farmer in America. The Department of Agriculture had just made it official. This black man had become the potato king of the world. 721,000 bushels in a single year. More than any white man had ever dreamed of growing. They had tried everything to stop him. Burned his properties, threatened his wife, and then his life. Hell, they even stole his gravestone, because when Junius George Groves spoke, the earth itself listened. And when white America tried to bury him, they learned one brutal lesson. You can burn a man's farms and torch his house, but you can never kill black excellence. This is the story of the slave who turned dirt into gold and potatoes into power, and the terror he struck in the hearts of every racist man in America. Let me take you back to 1859, to the world of American slavery, a world so twisted and evil that it's hard to believe it was real. In this sick world, Junius George Groves wasn't born as a human being. He was born as a thing that belonged to a white man by the name of Alfred Anderson. His mother, Mary, was owned by one of Kentucky's biggest slaveholders, while his father, Martin, was owned by a different white man on a nearby plantation. These two people loved each other, but the law said their love didn't matter because they were property. This was the world Junius was born into. Black families were bought and sold like cattle. Children were ripped from their mother's arms. Abuse and torture were just part of daily life on the plantation. Then came 1865, and everything changed. The Civil War was ending, and enslaved people across the South were tasting freedom for the first time. But nobody today talks about the brutal reality of the end of slavery. Freedom without resources was really just another kind of prison. Junius's mother found herself legally free, but practically helpless. She had to work whatever jobs she could find, usually the same backbreaking farm labor she'd done as a slave, except now she got paid almost nothing for it. The family was so poor that Junius could only go to school 3 months out of the year. The rest of the time, this little boy had to work in the fields just so his family could eat. But what made Junius different was his hunger for more. When he wasn't working, he was teaching himself to read and write by candlelight. By the time Junius reached his late teens, Reconstruction was in full swing, and for a second, it looked like black people might actually get a fair chance for a second in America. We had black congressmen getting elected, black senators, and black business owners finally making a name for themselves. But of course, white Southerners couldn't stand watching black people succeed, so they fought back with a vengeance. By the late 1870s, federal troops were pulling out of the South, and racist whites were taking back control with terrifying fury. They created Jim Crow laws designed to make black people second-class citizens. They formed terrorist groups like the Klan to intimidate and kill anyone who dared to succeed. The statistics from this era will make your blood boil. Between 1882 and 1968, there were over 4,000 recorded lynchings in the United States. That's one black person lynched every week for nearly a century. And those are just the ones we know about. Hundreds more were burned out of their homes, driven from their land, and terrorized into submission. This was the world 20-year-old Junius was living in when he made the decision that would define his entire life. In 1879, he heard about something called the Exoduster movement. Thousands of black people were fleeing the South for Kansas, a state that represented hope because it had fought against slavery during the Civil War. But getting to Kansas wasn't easy. You needed money for train fare, money for supplies, money to start over. Junius had none of that. So this man decided he was going to walk to freedom. Yes, you heard that right. A young black man, carrying everything he owned in a small bag, walking 500 miles through hostile territory where any white person could decide to kill him just for existing. Yeah, needless to say, this man had some balls of steel. By the way, if you're enjoying the kinds of stories we share here on this channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. Together, let's expose the hidden history they don't want you to know. Unfortunately, Kansas wasn't the promised land that some black folks had imagined. Yes, it was better than the South, but racism didn't stop at state lines. Black people still faced discrimination in jobs, housing, and education. Many of the farmers who made the journey found themselves in refugee camps, struggling to survive their first winter. But Junius, being Junius, refused to let circumstances define him. His first job was in a meatpacking house, where work meant standing for 12 hours a day in freezing cold buildings covered in blood and animal fat, all while the white supervisors treated black workers like they were disposable. If you got hurt, they'd fire you and hire someone else. If you complained about conditions, you'd be blacklisted from every job in town. This was freedom in 1879, the right to choose which white man would exploit your labor. Every night, Junius would come home exhausted and bloody, but he'd spend his few free hours planning his escape from wage slavery. He'd heard about opportunities in farming, and he started learning everything he could about agriculture. Then came the opportunity that would change everything. A white farmer named Jake Williamson was looking for someone to help him sharecrop 9 acres of land. Now, sharecropping was supposed to be a step up from slavery, but let's be real about what it actually was. It was a system designed to keep black people in debt and dependent on white landowners. Sharecropping worked like this. The white landowner would provide the land, tools, and seeds. The black farmer would do all the work. At the end of the season, they'd split the profits. But the landowner controlled the books, set the prices, and decided what everything was worth. Most sharecroppers ended up owing money to the landowner instead of making any profit. Williamson offered Junius 40 cents a day to work his land. 40 cents. That's about $13 in today's money for a full day of backbreaking labor under the hot sun. Most black men would have taken this deal and been grateful for it, because the alternative was often no work at all. But Junius wasn't most black men. Within the first week, Williamson realized he was dealing with someone special. Junius worked harder, smarter, and more efficiently than any farmhand he'd ever seen. The man had a natural understanding of soil, crops, and weather that seemed almost supernatural. By the end of the first month, Junius had proven his value so convincingly that Williamson raised his pay to 75 cents a day. But Junius wasn't satisfied with just being a wage worker. He negotiated for something that most white people thought black people were too stupid to understand: profit sharing. The boldness of this move was staggering. A formerly enslaved black man was sitting across from a white landowner and demanding not just wages, but a share of the business profits. In 1879 Kansas, this was some next-level revolutionary thinking. Junius convinced Williamson to give him 1/3 of everything they grew on those 9 acres. That first year, working those 9 acres with intelligence and determination that amazed everyone who saw it, Junius made $125. Remember, this man started with 90 cents. But what separated Junius from everyone else was his mindset. Instead of spending that money on things that would make his life more comfortable, he invested every penny. He bought his own land, purchased a milk cow, and got farming equipment. Other people saw $125 as money to spend, but Junius saw it as capital to build an empire. Local newspapers regularly published articles about the dangers of letting black people succeed, warning white folks that prosperous black neighbors would somehow contaminate their communities. There were constant threats of violence from groups like the Klan, who saw any successful black person as a threat to white supremacy. But Junius had something that racism couldn't touch: an unbreakable belief in his own worth, and an understanding that success was the best revenge against hate. By the mid-1880s, Junius and his wife had built something that was making white supremacists very uncomfortable. A thriving black-owned business that was outperforming most white-owned farms in the region. They had expanded from those original 9 acres to over 80 acres of prime farmland. Unfortunately, their success brought new dangers. As Junius became more prosperous, he became a bigger target for racial violence. Keep in mind that this was the decade when Jim Crow laws were first being implemented across the country. It was becoming illegal for black people to eat in the same restaurants, stay in the same hotels, or even drink from the same water fountains as white folk. In this environment of increasing segregation and violence, Junius decided that instead of trying to blend in, he was going to become so successful that he couldn't be ignored, studying agricultural science like his life depended on it. He experimented with different potato varieties, tested soil compositions, analyzed weather patterns, and developed farming techniques that nobody had ever tried before. By 1895, the Kansas State Agricultural Census recorded that Junius Groves owned 400 acres of potatoes, 170 acres of apple trees, 160 acres of corn, and 50 acres of cherry trees. He also owned 21 cows, 9 horses, and 24 hogs. A formerly enslaved black man now owned more productive farmland than most white farmers. He was outproducing, outthinking, and out-succeeding the very people who claimed to be naturally superior to him. This was a direct challenge to the entire foundation of white America. If black people were truly inferior, how could one of us be the best farmer on the planet? If we were really incapable of complex thinking, how had Junius developed agricultural techniques that no white farmer could match? But Junius wasn't satisfied with just being the best farmer. He understood that true power came from building wealth and using that wealth to create opportunities for other black people. He was shipping potatoes, fruits, and vegetables to the United States, Mexico, and Canada. He invested in mines in Indian Territory in Mexico. He had stock in Kansas banks and owned a majority interest in the Kansas City Casket and Embalming Company. Hell, he even co-founded the State Negro Business League with Booker T. Washington. The rest of America was trying to exclude us from business, but Junius was creating networks for black entrepreneurs. He understood that success was never just about individual achievement. It was about lifting up the entire community. But what really drove racists crazy was that Junius employed up to 50 workers during harvest season, both black and white. White men were taking orders from a black man, working on a black man's land, helping to build a black man's empire. But power made Junius a target. Throughout the early 1900s, as his wealth and influence grew, so did the threats against him. 3 of his mansions were mysteriously burned down over the years. His property was vandalized. He received death threats from clansmen and other white terrorist groups. But instead of retreating, instead of trying to make himself smaller, Junius doubled down on building black power. In 1913, he founded Groves Center, an entire town designed specifically for black families. He sold land to African American families at affordable prices, built schools and churches, and created businesses that employed black workers. White America was using segregation to oppress black people, but Junius was using it to create independent black prosperity. If white folks didn't want us in their spaces, we'd build better spaces for ourselves. On August 17, 1925, Junius George Groves died of a heart attack at age 66. Some say the stress of living as a successful black man in Jim Crow America literally broke his heart. The racism that he had fought his entire life may have finally claimed him, not through violence, but through the slow, grinding pressure of having to be perfect in a world that wanted him to fail. But even in death, Junius made a statement that white supremacists couldn't ignore. His funeral was the largest gathering that Kansas had ever seen. Over 3,000 people came to pay their respects, black and white, rich and poor, all acknowledging that they had witnessed something extraordinary. 11 ministers spoke at his service, each one testifying to the impact this one man had made on his community and his country. But the story doesn't end with his death. Even after Junius was gone, white racists couldn't let him rest in peace. His gravestone was stolen, not once, but twice. They couldn't stand the idea that future generations might visit his grave and be inspired by his story. They thought they could make us forget that a black man had once been the best farmer in the world, that he had built an empire from 90 cents, that he had proven every racist theory wrong through sheer excellence. But you can't erase truth. You can't burn down inspiration. You can't steal the blueprint that Junius created for Black success. Because that's what Junius George Groves really did. He didn't just grow potatoes. He created a template for how Black people could build wealth, power, and community in a hostile world. His story teaches us that Black excellence is the best revenge against racism. That success is the most powerful answer to hate. That building wealth and creating opportunities for your community is the best way to prove that you belong wherever you choose to be. And if you think Junius Groves struck fear into the hearts of racists, wait until you hear about the man who absolutely terrified them. A former slave who became a senator and bent the chains of slavery into weapons of justice. Click the video you see on your screen right now to discover the incredible story of Charles Caldwell, the blacksmith who became the nightmare that white America couldn't wake up from.